Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual seminar. And I'm going to hand over to our speaker, Stephen Hughes. And I should say, Dr. Hughes has recently joined the RAI as our film officer and festival director. And so we're very happy to have him here to present today for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I might suggest that everyone, for the time being, switches off their cameras. It will help the the bandwidth issue for everyone for the time being. But please do turn them on once I'm happy to see you all, but once we get to discussion, that's really good to be able to see everyone. But as long as whilst I'm presenting, it probably makes sense to just keep the camera off. I'll be sharing the screen. Right now, and we'll start moving through our discussion. The first thing I have to do is to do a little promotional work, if you don't mind. PowerPoint. First of all, I'd like to just sort of announce what we're doing at RAI on the film. In a sense, this is somewhat part of it, but we are, as you can see, we have this shiny new logo for our upcoming film festival, which will be an online edition this March 19th to 28th, and it's we're in the middle of putting the program together. We have 420 films that are submitted. We have lots of things that are coming up. And if you want to follow updates about it, we have an e-newsletter you can sign up to. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram for sort of news and updates as we go along. And we'll be, we'll be, as and when we get sort of news and things of different pieces of the program, we'll be sharing that information. Of course, everyone is welcome to attend. The prices have gone down a lot since we're going online. So anyway, I hope you all be able to sort of come back and join us from there. The other sort of bit of promotional work, if I may, is that this talk actually coincides with our release of a new DVD set that contains a lot of the films that are a lot of the films from David MacDougall's project that we'll be talking about, Childhood and Modernity. And we'll be screening 3 of the films that are actually on this DVD that were made from various video workshops with children in India. So if you want to purchase it or for institutional reasons or personal screening, you can now it's now available from us in the UK and Europe. So that's my sort of pitch. I mean, it's not. I mean, this is a kind of launch. We just made it available on our website, but this is also kind of paper as well about David MacDougall's involvement and about the films in question. So the title, What Can We Learn from Children About Ethnographic Filmmaking? David MacDougall, Indian Children and Documentary Film. So I'm assuming most of you know who David MacDougall is. For more than 50 years, he's been one of the leading and most prolific of ethnographic filmmakers. Very often along with his wife, Judith McDougall. They've collaborated on a series of very, often people see them as demanding and complex films. They're making sort of serious ethnographic films that are not sort of made for TV documentaries. He's known for an observational style, which he prefers to refer to as quiet watching. And both of them have sort of pushed observational film in different directions. He's been awarded the RAI's Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2008, and he sort of jokes that he wasn't anywhere near done making films, and he jokes that it's actually more like a midlife award. That's probably right. He's not slowed down in terms of the filmmaking front at all. But in addition to being probably one of the leading filmmaker of his generation, really, ethnographic filmmaking, he's also distinguished himself as one of the most erudite and sort of compelling essayists on topics of filmmaking, visual anthropology, documentary film styles. There are three collections of his edited essays, and they're sort of a must-read for anyone in the field. He writes very well. They're extremely compelling essays. It's worthwhile to check them out if you don't know them already. Of course, I could talk about David MacDougall's work all day. I'd be happy to do so. But of course, the focus today is really his work with Indian children. And so, but before I get into that, I just want to sort of hint at a kind of sort of broader context about how David MacDougall's already been working with children in India in a kind of educational setting. So those of you who have been following the work of David MacDougall over the last 20 years, you'll know he's moved to a focus on children in educational settings. I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's perhaps not surprising that David MacDougall has gravitated in this direction because he himself kind of, from his own background, he was raised in the United States as a child of an American-Canadian couple who happened to be teachers at sort of independent schools that were mostly boarding schools. So he grew up, in fact, living at boarding schools where his parents were teaching in the United States. So he basically, in a sense, that his home life was always already as a child within the context of schools. But in terms of his own focus on education studies, educational settings, it's really in the context of India, and his now 5 series of films on the Doon school, which is a sort of independent school, an elite boarding school, really, in North India. Doon was the site for his first real extended look at the educational setting. And these films are really marked because it was David MacDougall's first foray into digital filmmaking. So he was freed from the constraints of the bigger camera. He had to rethink a different sort of style. He found it was possible with digital, it was less intrusive. He was able to do sort of more kind of intimate sort of filming in a different way. And he also wasn't constrained by the limits of expensive film stock. So he could shoot a lot more. And he's written about how digital film really changed his ways of thinking. But so you can kind of see Doon School as a sort of an extended experiment with the new media of digital filmmaking. He followed this up with another series of 3 films on another school in South India. It's another sort of boarding school, but this is a kind of progressive co-educational school in Andhra Pradesh, Rishi Valley. And his last sort of major film on children is called Gandhi's Children, which is in a kind of residential shelter institution in Delhi that is a mix of orphans, street children, even children who have criminal records. And he is another beautiful film on that institution. And it's a very different sort of set of children than you would have seen in the Doon School. So all this, he's sort of moved already towards working with children. So by the time he comes to this idea of doing video workshops with children, he had already been working in India for 20 years, at least 15 of them he had been spending doing these films of children. And as is his fashion, along with his films, he's also writing essays. And in particular, I draw your attention to the essay he wrote and published in the 2006 volume Corporeal Image, Films on Childhood. This is a very broad base thinking about the way children are represented, not only in documentary film, but in feature filmmaking. And it's worth sort of paying attention. In a sense, it's a kind of theoretical reflections really that went alongside of him thinking about his own practice, making films about children. And in this, he asking key questions, simply why would you make films about children? All of us have already experienced it. What more is there to know? We've all sort of gone through that. And he's quite clear by looking through the ways children have been sort of focused on films as a tendency to romanticize them, sort of portray childhood as a kind of innocence. And he sort of kind of goes through and deconstructs a lot of the myth making that goes around it. And so he's sort of asking, what possibly can I add to what we already know? And for him, the key question here is that the overriding agenda for him about making films about children is to rediscover their complexity, to give them the respect due to persons living in themselves rather than in our conceptions of them, to put ourselves in a better position to learn from them. And so he's looking very careful not to take a kind of condescending tone towards children. He wants to give them the platform so that they can teach us. And David MacDougall, in thinking about this before he gets to the video project, he's thought a lot about these there's been a lot of projects with children video workshops by anthropologists, by all kinds of other kinds of people working in education or different kinds of social work projects. But in particular, I think he singles out the example of photo voice, which tends to use photography, but and he's clear that the project on the video workshop is meant to sort of steer away from using a kind of predetermined therapeutic approach. He characterizes a kind of as having a kind of idealism about using visual media. So somehow, if you give video cameras to disaffected urban youth, it's going to somehow solve their problems. So he's very keen to distance themselves from that kind of use of visual media. And for him, these kinds of projects are too often condescending to children and youth. They assume that there's a problem that with the children and the video is somehow going to be a way to solve that. So instead, this project of video workshops with children was framed around the issue of how can we take the children seriously as filmmakers. Is film capable of allowing these children to make a sort of positive contribution in their own right, being able to express themselves as individuals and agents of their own forms of representation. So over a 5-year period in this project, which was titled Childhood and Modernity, it was funded by the Australian Research Council. David and a small work of other collaborators encouraged children to explore their surroundings using video cameras. So there were, in total, there were 6 workshops in these various locations in North India. They lasted 6 to 12 weeks each. Children's ranged from 10 to 13, depending on the kind of schools. And this sort of spread of locations, he was choosing different kinds of schools at different regionals and urban rural settings, different sort of class schools, in order to get a kind of range. It's not, obviously you can see he hasn't touched any of South India, but it was, or Northeast India, but it was just to give a kind of a gesture towards a kind of diversity of different responses to see what could come up with that. And so the sort of basic questions underlying this project to begin with was, what do children of a particular age group, and this age group was key for him because they're not quite full-fledged teenagers. He saw this as an important sort of transitional phase. You're moving away from being small children to having a different kind of awareness, but of oneself. But in the ages of 10 to 13, He sort of felt that children weren't really as self-conscious as they might have been. So if he had done from 13 to 16, he might have gotten, these young children having a different, in a different stage of their own sort of personal identity making, that sometimes they're finding sort of more difficult to be themselves. And I think you'll see from the films that we screen, the kids that he is are very self-confident in themselves and the settings with which they're filming. So the kind of questions he wants to ask is in what ways are these kids using cameras in their own ways that perhaps adults would not be using them? What sort of things are they looking at? And how experimental are they? He didn't show them films during the workshop. He did not teach them modes of documentary filmmaking. He didn't tell them the difference between an observational film, or didn't explain what an essay film might be. He didn't talk about reflexivity, any of the kinds of things you might expect in a kind of other kind of filmmaking workshop educational setting. The idea was just to teach them the techniques of film shooting. And so he it's a sort of hypothesis, really. Does this filmmaking help us understand the way that children understand themselves and the world that they're living in? And from this, he sort of borrows on a kind of sort of recent developments in neuroscience that claim that children's minds are different than that of adults. And so insofar as it's only after one is 20 years or older that the mind is fully developed, and that children's minds are much more complex. There are more pathways, there's more links, more connections, that is gradually narrowed down as one matures and becomes an adult. So in some ways, children's may be better to explore the world in more open ways than adults. So this was a kind of hypothesis, and if this is the case, then there may be things that we can learn about the socialization project, and children may be able to teach us something about their world that we have lost. So I guess in some ways you can think about it as children. Children are kind of some ways the last tribe of anthropology, the ultimate other of anthropology. We've all been children. We all know what it's like. But once we become adults, we can never actually regain the way it was to think like a child. And so no matter how much we try as adults, we're going to be cut off in certain important ways from the way that children think, the way that they engage in the world. Now, it's important to point out that David MacDougall didn't have sort of naive epistemological assumptions that somehow we can escape our own selves and have some unmediated access to the way that children think. If you think about the through Navajo Eyes project that was done in the 1960s by Saul Worth and John Adair, they seem to think that using sort of this idea of the superior wharf hypothesis, that somehow if you get Navajo Native Americans to make their own films, we can think the way they think in terms of the sort of emic categories and the way they think. David MacDougall isn't sort of making any sort of epistemological claims here, but suggests that nonetheless it's still worthwhile for us to consider the way that children go about putting their films together. So, okay, the task for these children was to choose topics they considered important in their own lives, their families, communities, and they were asked to approach these film projects as well as research. So, after several weeks of basic instruction using video cameras, they took out the loan equipment on their own, unsupervised, and filmed. So. And they're working towards getting enough footage that could be used as a kind of research project. Okay, we'll get into the films now. I think it's important to say they probably shot, roughly, I think David said, between 3 and 5 hours of footage. And the films that we'll see today are a couple of are 17 minutes and one is 12 minutes long. So there's a lot of sort of editing down. We can talk about maybe that later. I'll screen 3 short films. I'll pause after each one of these films for a brief moment, and then I'll make a couple comments about it. But I expect that in a crowd like this, it will elicit very different responses from all of you. And afterwards, during our discussion, I'd be very keen to find out, do these films work for you? For me, they're full of all kinds of surprises. But so crucially, be thinking, what are we learning about? Are these children filmmaking making something that you wouldn't expect to see other kinds of filmmakers making? And how does this example of collaborative filmmaker work as a kind of visual methodology? Is this something that you can see working in other contexts, or what is the sort of potential for this? So the first film we're going to see was originally edited as part of a film called Delhi at 11. It's the first one that David released. These are the opening sequences of that. He's with the 4 filmmakers, and we'll be seeing films from the 2 central kids beneath David MacDougall. They were shot during a 3-month period, or in 2012, at an experimental school in Delhi. Each of them were 11 years old, hence the title Delhi at 11. The films offer special perspective on Indian family workshop. So that's the beginning. One of the things that surprises me, part of I should first of it is David MacDougall. It's kind of quiet watching in this one. It's very patient, keen eye for detail. But what really struck me about this one, particularly the first time I watched it, was the kind of camera angles. You can really tell the difference that it's being shot from a lower angle. It's looking up at people. The camera it sort of picks up on the children. The main person that he follows, Ravi follows with his camera, is if you like the youngest child, the youngest of the employees who works there. It's like he's more active. He's doing different kinds of things. He's kind of attuned to watching what the children are doing. So that struck me as one little sort of detail, but. And it really makes a difference to shoot from a lower height and how you interact with the world. The other thing is that it's quite phenomenal is how Ravi, being slight, a small child himself, is how he's able to work in such small spaces. It's really crowded inside that store. There are like 4 or 5 people in that little small space, and he's able to sort of get shots that I think somebody like me or larger adults would never have been able to sort of get into that space. The other thing I was particularly struck by this is that you can see that is the way that others are responding to the filmmaker. And I think this is another sort of difference. And in most cases here, the adults are really good at ignoring him or dismissing his presence altogether. It's just kind of a school thing, right? Or you find actually adults, there's that fantastic scene where the man is smoking a cigarette and, he takes a kind of playful stance, he's acknowledging the child behind the camera. And there's a kind of ease with which, people are able, to accept the presence of a camera when there's a child behind it. They're able to overcome any of some of their self-consciousness in some ways that they may have had, when confronted with a camera in their face. So it seems that this, particularly the adults, are not sort of taking the filmmaking process maybe as serious as they might have if like some other kind of outsider there was filming it. Those are just some initial thoughts. But now let's go to the next one, which is an altogether different film altogether. This is kind of this is the essay film, right? She clearly is almost like investigative journalism. She's making a film about gender inequality. She gathers evidence. She does interviews. She actually coaches her interviews a little bit She wants them to say certain kinds of things, and then by the end, she kind of builds the film sort of builds to a kind of emotional climax where she's talking to the camera. She's almost like a confessional moment up on the roof. Um, um, where she's, really putting her final plea to us. It's a very different kind of film than the first. And we see some similarities. The camera follows her own children in her own age range much more than parents come in. Older women only have that small role. There's a way in which there's sort of attuned, if you like, to a different kind of social world that is not, wouldn't maybe be as easy for an adult to be able to capture, and certain playfulness with the film subjects as well. They're having fun, they're engaged. So let me just quickly move on to the last one now. Okay, that's the last of the films, and this last film was again in a very different style. She's I don't know, the thing that comes across is the kind of affection and love you feel from the film subjects towards the filmmaker. And it's an unusual sort of thing that you don't quite get that sense of intimacy. There's some fantastic sort of shots where she's following the action, she's directing it a little bit, and there's it's just such an, you might call this reflexive because you hear people talking about the camera, the filming as it's happening, but in a sense, it's also, there's just this ease with which she's continually interacting with her little world, her family, her social setting, her neighborhood, such supreme confidence and ease that comes across through this, And clearly this is not a film, this could not be achieved by somebody who was an outsider, somebody that is so steeped in this milieu, if you like. And it feels, the shooting on this really feels to me very instinctual. So now we'll sort of, I guess, we're going to move towards opening this up for discussion and hear what you have to think about it. We'll be taking questions in the chat box to start with, and we've already got lots of chats going on, or we have different comments. So feel free to, if you want to sort of put your camera on if you want, and while you're sort of getting yourself ready, I'll just read you one quote that David MacDougall said after we sort of thought back in this project. He said, one of the surprises for me was that the sheer variety in the ways that the children used the camera. I expected them to imitate the models they found on television or in Bollywood cinema, but perhaps because we were asking them to do something quite outside their usual experience, to film the reality of their own surroundings and to use the camera as an exploratory tool. I was constantly struck by the originality of their approach. In a sense, they seem to be reinventing filmmaking as they go along. That might be a good place for us to sort of start and jump in. So does somebody want to come in and just give some of your impressions from the film? I see Richard Tapper. Hello, Richard. You've turned your camera on and your mic on. Would you like to have the floor?
Yes, just to take up your last remarks, or rather David MacDougall's last remarks. Watching these films, I was indeed amazed by how natural the film making, the shooting seemed to be, and how like his own style. And you said yourself at the beginning that he hadn't trained them in terms of any kind of approach. He just told them how to work the camera. I'm wondering how true that really was, because I sort of felt McDougall behind the camera most of the time, if you follow me. Now, does that mean that McDougall films like a child? Or that somehow or other that's the only way of filmmaking, which is what the implication, I think, of what his last comment was.
I suppose if you see all of them in total, there are 24 films that were made, and you see that I mean, you can see the full variety, you know, and the three that I showed you are perhaps, it may be a skewed sample, but I know what you mean about in terms of it still seems to have an unbearable sort of stamp of what you might expect from David MacDougall. And I would suggest that probably has to do with the editing process as much as anything.
Where he did come in. Where he did come in and advise, if not actually do the work.
Yeah, no, and it's probably worthwhile to say a few words about the editing process. Really, I mean, I was prepared for this to come up. Really, your question seemed. I mean, I have to say it was my question the first time I watched this as well. How come it looks so much like David MacDougall already, and though we know it's not. And he said, you know, the editing, a lot of the editing was done in camera, which means that there's a basic kind of chronological sequential edit, right? So they're not jumping around with the time frames and other kinds. They're mostly sticking to the progression that the students had, and there are big chunks in there that are just as they film them, right? You can see the long shots in the last film where she's following the goats through the alleyways. It's all done in one take, right? There's not going to be any editing there, but where there are a few moments where you can actually, well, I'll come back to that. But so what they did is they sat down with the material, they watched it through together, and they did their first rough cut. They were able to cut things. They were able to find agreement pretty easily about what things could cut, because there were things that weren't quite right technically. The camera was moving around. They really quite hadn't got the subject in frame, and for various reasons, they were able to, to cut out a lot of that material. So they cut it down into a kind of rough cut, and then David MacDougall took it back to Australia, where he cut a little around the edges to sort of make smooth transitions. So, like for example, in the last film, you saw the grandfather carrying the bucket of water, right? So, and there's like a seamless cut, right, between two shots, where the camera is following the bucket of water. So, it seems to me that's the David MacDougall, the film editor, has made that splice and that nice little cut, so we could just follow the action of the bucket of water, through the way. And there's other moments when you can definitely see the hand of David MacDougall are the freeze frames, which is a way of condensing, and those are sort of observational moments, right? Because he's actually selected that frame that are showing us little details. That it's in effect the editor is saying, stop, look at this ethnographic detail I want you to look at. Whereas the children filmmaker are just, they're just doing the film shot. Yes, they would have filmed, the crisps on the shelf. Yes, they would have filmed, the families doing different things at different times. But, there are little moments in there where you could definitely see the hands of the work of the editor. So, he maintains that, the final period is what we see is really the films that the children, are themselves happy with. For example, after he did that, he took it back. He took the films back to the children one last time for the final edit. So they went through and they talked through what had come out, and whether or not more things needed to come in. And maybe the children were deferring to the expert, in that context. There's an unequal power relation there between editor and the child filmmaker, clearly. So it's hard to say how much, they did it, but, I don't know. But does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I yield the floor.
All right, Stu, I see Lola Martinez has her hand up. Lola, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, so I've just remembered to unmute myself, which I often forget to do. Thank you very much, Steve. I want to come back to this question that Richard has raised, because it seems to me that right at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about changes in the way ethnographic films, documentary films had developed due to changes in the technology. And certainly one of the things I got from discussing films with filmmakers is that they often begin from a discussion of the technology they can use. And it's not that the technology totally dictates what can happen, but it makes it easier to film at your height. It makes it easier to follow someone with the bucket of water than it would be if you were trailing a large camera on a boom mic and a couple of people. So do you think perhaps this also plays into why the films seem as intimate as David MacDougall's own work has become over time, that the children were working with equipment that was easy for them to use?
It is a good question. I think you're absolutely spot on when you sort of, the implication of your question is that, this project could not have been done before there was the digital video camera, right? You can't imagine, these small children carrying these huge, cameras on their shoulder, the Eclair camera, whatever, on their shoulder, that was like, probably half their weight. So yes, I think, and I don't think David MacDougall would have loaned out his, prized camera to children. He talks about the first workshops he did, particularly at the Doon School. He taught some video workshops, and the kids were doing a weekly video diary, and that lasted all of 2 weeks until the video camera landed in the river. And that was the end of it. And one of the things he said about they had 4 of these Sony cameras and they used through the entire project. And all they did was lose one lens cap and a cable. So he was very pleased that the equipment survived so well. But it takes a lot for a filmmaker to give out their kit to somebody else, because filmmakers become attached to their cameras, and these children did too.
Yes, I can imagine.
In a way, we saw that in that sort of confessional scene when Anush is speaking to her camera on at night in the dark. She's talking to the camera like it's her friend. It's this. It's, who knows who she's thinking she's talking to when she's talking into the camera. She's who that audience is, but it's this heartfelt plea about it's really this. The whole thread, the main thrust of the film. But David MacDougall has written a lot about his experience with video cameras. And I wish he'd republished that in his recent essays. It's actually published in Anthropology Today, I think, in about 2001. And it's a very long essay for Anthropology Today, where he's talking about his shift to digital video. But I wouldn't go so far to say it's all the technology. Yes,
no, that's what I said. It can't all be the technology. Yeah,
I think a lot of it has to do with the children are smaller. In a sense, it's the comparison between a sort of an adult with a digital video and a child with a digital video. Something like the difference between doing a static shot on a tripod and having a GoPro. Because children are more mobile. They're, and they're also working in much tighter spaces. That produces I think it helps a kind of intimacy. They get closer to the action. The camera's lower. People are often, sort of affectionate. Older people and children are touching children. There's a kind of physical proximity that happens with children that you don't, adults are more, stay out of my space, don't come too close.
Yeah, but I mean, it is something we noticed, I think, at the beginning of the 21st century at the RAI Film Festival, that the films that seemed more intimate had been made by people using smaller cameras. And that's why I mentioned this point, that we do see a possible shift in camera use, and because of the technology. That doesn't stop. Some people still like to use the big camera and put it on a tripod, and editing is certainly key in all of this. But yeah, I just wanted to think about that point of having a more available technology helps with this project. Yeah.
And it may be something that David MacDougall was alluding to when he said that when he looks over the sort of range of all the children's films, is that they were sort of reinventing for him. They were reinventing filmmaking as they go along. Right? So he saw them instinctually, sort of using kind of what we would recognize as certain kinds of film styles, but they're kind of doing it on the hoof, without even bothering between, am I observational, am I what am I being reflexive, or whatever else theories you're operating in your head. These like discursive frames we have for what the camera should be doing in relationship to the film.
Yeah, one day I'll show you my children's version of Alice in Wonderland with a video camera.
That's a seminar for next month, Lola. It's a seminar for next month.
Okay.
Who's next?
Thank you. I need to run, so thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for the question.
So I've got a question from Felicia Hughes Freeland. I don't know if Felicia wants to come on screen, as it were.
I can't find myself.
Oh, there you are.
Yes, where's my
We
camera?
can hear you.
Here we are. Here we are. Sorry. It's quite interesting. David submitted Delhi at 11 to the RAI Film Festival that was in Edinburgh as a student film. And I was one of the student film judges, and we deemed that his editorial input had been too great for these to be considered student films. And there was a certain amount of discussion with David about that, but I remember that was a factor. And there's a big difference between rough cuts and fine cuts. But I just wanted to add to the discussion about technology and throws in it would be very interesting, because now kids are filming on their phones all the time. They're putting up TikTok videos. It's technology. And what we've seen in these at one point, the digital revolution made these little HD cameras, well, it was before HD, little tiny cameras, very accessible. But now everybody potentially can be filming on their phones if they're young enough. Of course, some of us can't quite manage it. But it would be very interesting, I would think, to show these films to children now, because children now are so much more sophisticated with their visual technologies. And I mean, what Lola was saying earlier about big cameras on tripods, that's might not be the most the common way people encounter films now. And I know feature films have been shot on phones.
This is how they encounter it right here, the telephone.
Yeah,
and I think this is a big difference. When David was doing these films, whatever, the 4G technology hadn't hit India. People weren't making. You could take pictures with your phones, but that was the mobile phones. Even just 8 years ago. I mean, the big change in India happens in 2017, 18, when something like 400 million people get access to 4G within the span of a year, so now you can imagine children as young as 10 or 13, are making films all the time with their phones, right?
Yeah.
And they don't need David MacDougall to help them, and they probably aren't editing them, except they are probably putting filters and things you might do on Snapchat or WhatsApp or whatever. And until recently, you might be interested to know that India is the #1 per capita sort of user of TikTok, which all of you are probably familiar of any sort of social media, which is basically filmmaking. If you actually wanted to do this project today, I would say, go to TikTok and see. I mean, obviously TikTok is very framed, and they give you all, they help you make your own film with all these presets. It's not exactly the same. I'm not saying David's project wouldn't work the same, but there's a way in which you could sort of tap into sort of young filmmakers in a different way than, say, this project has done.
I was wondering, thinking a bit of Michael Apter's 7 Up series, and I was thinking, what would Delhi at 21 look like? I wonder if any of these I mean, really, Ravi's filming was fantastically good. The way he followed things, the cigarettes, the rice, following the action really, really skillfully, I thought. And I was wondering if, I'm sure David would hate the idea of a Delhi at 21. But I was also, just to share, it doesn't deal with childhood, but the last issue of Anthrovision was about collaboration, because we often talk about handing over the camera, but it's such a difficult thing. And there's a very excellent set of articles in the last Anthrovision, and I'll copy the link into the chat box if anyone's interested.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, that's me done. Thank you, Steve, for a really nice presentation as well, taking us back to those films.
Thank you very much. So I've got another question now from Alexandra Tompkins. I don't know if she wants to pop up, but maybe I'll just ask the question and she can come up if she's got something else to say. So she says, how much time did the children have to learn to film, spend in the filming workshops, and how long did they have to make their films? Is it days or hours? Oh, here's
to add to this question as well, how also do you know how he chose which children to involve in the project from the schools as well?
Yeah, I do. The workshops, you know, were, some were shorter than others, but originally they were planned to be 6 weeks, and some turns out to be, you know, shorter. That they generally spent 2 weeks. The entire group spent 2 weeks learning the sharing, taking turns on the camera, learning the techniques, and during those 2 weeks, we talked about it. And everyone put together a pitch for a research project. And so they went through, and each child, I mean, I don't think everyone actually put a pitch, but some chose not to, but they had to choose amongst themselves, you know, which pitches they were going to do. And this was collective in a way. I mean, I think probably David worked with facilitators and other people to help them with the teaching, because, you know, he had to spread himself around between, I guess most of them were 12, maybe less students at a time, right? Mm-hmm. And so already not every child did a project, right? So they had to deal with that. Some children didn't get selected, and some people were excluded. And so some of the children actually did actually film students talking about, you know, their frustration of how they hadn't been selected. But that was something they had to deal with in their small group, and it was just the kind of idea. I mean, I think David said that there was some, you know, group discussions about them, but I think probably David is the one who made the final cut in terms of whose ideas he thought were going to be most viable. Mm-hmm. So already that's a narrowing, you know, of kinds of topics and even approaches to different topics. That again is back to Richard Tapper's question about, you know, how is it that, you know, David MacDougall is shaping the final outcome, right? You know, if you've actually, you know, if you're handpicking the pitches, you're likely to get projects that are more amenable to a filmmaking style that comes naturally to David MacDougall.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
I've got a comment from Anne-Marie Carty. I saw her come up. I don't know if she wants to say anything on camera, but it's going back to the idea about the camera size and children.
Oh, sorry, I need some headphones.
There you go. Okay, there she is. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I probably haven't got a lot to add from what I said, but just thinking this discussion about camera size really reminds me of the days when we changed from film to video. And there was this idea that little video cameras made everything observational shooting much easier. And of course, so dinosaurs of us from the film days were very much like, it's not the equipment, it's how you approach people. It just reminded me of that. And also the comment I made about the work I was doing is I was doing deeply participatory work, working with children in trauma. So my participatory video methodology, if you like, was very much around what happens if you work with people to do participatory work without teaching them any style at all. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a lack of limitations on your resources, so it was PhD research, so I could do it for as long as I liked, and I wasn't constrained by time or funders' requirements. So I was able to be very free, and it was just really interesting to watch the children's use of the camera, the cameras, we had 3 cameras, unfold over time, and how they very much did choose styles of filmmaking they were already familiar with in order to express certain things. So they would choose game show formats if they thought they could discuss a particular topic, or if they wanted very serious interviews, then they would grab the big camera and they would get me to show them how to do an interview on the big camera, and then they would snatch it from me and say, right, you go and do this interview and I'll film it. And there was something there that I still have some value, really, that film is valuable in creating a sense of gravitas when people want to reflect on things. They feel they're being taken seriously, they feel the environment is serious, and from that point of view, the big camera had its value, on a tripod sometimes as well, because it was about creating those very particular spaces. So it's in no way criticism of anybody, it was just an observation, really. But I was working in a very different arena. It wasn't a film production, it was very participatory. So
I think those are good observations.
By these things.
It is absolutely fascinating. And I think one of the things that I think you've put your finger on there is that it's a sort of rare privilege to be able to see films made by children. You know, and I think if we were accustomed to being able to sort of, instead of watching films from the sort of the great documentary filmmakers or that have been the best films that have been selected for a festival, if we actually had access to more films by children, we might be able to actually say a lot more about the way that people come instinctually to that. And I think you're absolutely right about, you know, there's that first picture where David is with the 4 filmmakers. There's so much pride amongst those children, you know. There's something when they have the camera, they have a certain confidence and presence where people treat them differently, you know. People, you know, like for example, how many times did Kieran walk past those men playing cards and they never even looked up or paid attention? Right? But like the one time she's following her grandfather to the camera, you know, they're saying, oh, look who's here, look what they got. And, you know, can I watch those films? You know, are we going to be in it? You know, in a way that they're giving, it's not that they were, you know, whatever, they had to stop and take notice for a way that probably they wouldn't have done in everyday life. So I think that comes through in the films itself, which is very interesting. Because I think, you know, I've seen not all 24 of these films, but one of the things that I was reminded is that adults are very good at ignoring children. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and children are really good at paying attention to each other. And that was sort of part of what I got out of it for me. And I suppose you already know that from having done this experiment sort of once before, but it would be good to sort of get everyone who's done, because there's been a lot of sort of working with, you know, video and film projects with children. It'd be interesting to get everyone together and kind of separate to see, you know, what comes out, because I'm sure there are patterns. I'm sure there are things that, you know, lessons that we could learn. Thank you. More questions?
Next, we've got a question from Trond, if you want to.
Yeah, hey, I'm Trond from the University of Tromsø in Northern Norway. So we have, we have this visual anthropology program here as well. And I've been involved in participatory video making for children and youths for since 2003. And I learned filmmaking by Mcdougall, you could say. He was giving us courses when I was a master's student back a long time ago. So I know his work, and I was very fascinated by this, but I think that he is so defensive, or he's so little ambitious on his own, what he's doing. And And you said in the beginning, and the sound was a little bad, but you said he's not supporting the approach which assumed that there's a problem with children and that video might solve these problems. And I will deeply disagree in that. Or I think that there's an enormous potential working with the idea of problems, with the approach he got, or with that kind of observational approach, thinking that children's problem or youth problems or whatever kind of problems there might be, the gaze from outside on someone is a problem of communication, you know. I've done youth research many places in the world, and very often problems with youth are adults looking at young people. And when they get these means of communication, you know, going into what they find interesting, as we saw for me, the two last film was obviously the most interesting one, which were because they were on topics, themes that were engaging and interesting for their kids themselves. So I would say that he would, I wish he was more inspired by Jean Rouge, or, you know, this ambition of having dialogues, cross-cultural dialogues within academia. I have found great pleasure and interest in collaborating with psychologists that work on marginalized groups in different ways and so on, and really having kind of very optimistic kind of endings of workshops, because the kids, through the media, through getting the power of using that camera, is kind of getting into things that adults doesn't see, and adults observe and discover things that they didn't know before they saw the films about I have this experience of getting hugs from grandmothers, you know, that they're so happy to understand their grandchildren after seeing the films that their grandchildren have made about their lives. You know, so there are some potential there, which is much greater than our small, narrow visual anthropology discourse, being very fascinating about film angles and how beautiful they are using their technology. It is, to me, this debate is much, just to provoke you a little, is of much greater interest than just that.
That's a really, I couldn't agree with you more, Tron. That's an excellent point, and I thank you for making it. And I mean, I'll say a couple qualifications. You know, David, that he's not one for polemic. You know, and he wouldn't ever say that the approach that you've outlined is not worthwhile. It's just he was trying to do something slightly different with that. But even in his own way, and perhaps it's my own fault that I have not given him. I did invite him actually to join us today, but it's like at 4 a.m. in Australia, and he politely declined. So it's fair enough. But one of the things that he did think that this one of the main aims of this project was that that children could get something out of the filmmaking project. They'd learn to see the world in a new way. They'd be able to reflect on themselves and their family and their immediate circumstances. That would give them new perspective, make the people in their lives look at them differently. So in a sense, that is kind of maybe a very hesitant acknowledgement of the kind of, if you like, the social work that these collaborative community youth video projects can actually do. And by all means, I would like to just really underline that it's doing a huge disservice to these children and children filmmakers to somehow reduce it to being a matter of, you know, how they help ethnographic filmmakers develop their craft. You know, I mean, if you are going to take children seriously and this kind of project seriously, you have to recognize the fact that the real payoff is what they get out of it, and what their family, their communities, what the film does for them. So I think it absolutely really important to sort of bring us back to that point, Trond. I look forward to sort of looking up and seeing the work that you've done on this.
I'll present a paper on your conference in March.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Look forward to seeing you.
Right, so we've got a question from Ayusha Gupta now. If you want to come up onto the screen.
Hi.
There we go.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really really fun to see the clips as well, because I'm from Delhi and I've been doing a series of a module with Professor Lola on classic ethnographic films, and one of the things that's difficult to actually engage with ethnographic films is that you don't understand the language and you spend most of the time reading the subtitles. It was really fun to watch something that I could engage with. So I actually wanted to think a little more about discursive frames. And before I pose my question, I thought perhaps I should outline the context of my question. So one of the contexts is the series of ethnographic films, classic ethnographic films that I've been watching with Professor Lola. And the second context is the second film in which we have, I forgot the little girl's name, but we have, she's sort of investigating gender equality, perception and experience of femininity and masculinity in the Indian society or her society. And what really intrigued me was in front of her camera, though the girls who answered these questions may have for sure been experiencing this sort of double standard, but there seemed to be a performative and repetitive element to how they were narrating their answers. It's like they had memorized the answer and they just needed to be prompted and they would just go on. And if you hear it in Hindi, you can just see like, oh, okay, yeah, she has definitely memorized it. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm by no means trying to negate their experience. I'm just trying to talk about discursive frames. And so
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. You can tell it's been staged somehow. Like they've been coached up. Right? The filmmaker knows what she wants to say.
Yeah.
And she wants her film subjects to be on topic.
And this is especially noticeable when she is asking the toddler really, and the toddler forgets. And then she prompts, and then she forgets, and then she prompts. So it was especially poignant at that time. So the question that I want to pose is, to what extent can I kind of want to think about the relationship between an ethnographer's prompt and the filmed subject. And so I was wondering, to what extent can an ethnographer prompt or ask questions before hindering the organic unfolding of events in front of the camera? And then how is this, or why is this only problematic in sort of when we consider classic ethnographic films, but not when it's a project, grassroots project like this, where it's not really the ethnographer, but actually somebody who has, who does not have this theoretical baggage of thinking about ethnography, who's just hands-on.
I think it's a worthwhile question. I'm glad you picked up on that, because it is a kind of obvious thing. But I think part of what that reflects is the fact that whatever she clearly has, she has an idea that she has a storyline that she's decided in advance. All right. So, and it's a script, right? It is a kind of framework she wants. I mean, people do make films like this, right? Any kind of essay film or expository film, it's making an argument about a point. It wants to get something across. And of course, then everything you present in the film is all evidence that leads you to one final conclusion, right? So, this is a standard kind of filmmaking, and you sort of wonder where she would have, how instinctively she would have, had that model in mind. Is she watching, an exposés on television, investigative journalism? Is she watching news? It's hard to say really where she's getting that from. But I think she's not encumbered by this idea of cinema verite or observational film. That somehow from behind the camera, you shouldn't be directing the action. she doesn't, it's not even an issue to her, right? Because she's not, she hasn't somehow, drunk the Kool-Aid that's spiked with observational film stuff. So, it is a kind of, I mean, if she'd gone to film school, you'd say this is naive, but because she hasn't, I think where I see it is it just shows how determined and how shows her conviction, that it's really the sort of, it's kind of nice to be able to see the sort of directorial impulse actually playing out on screen,
Yeah, I see what you mean, because I think it's like, even though the theoretical, the thought of ethnography doesn't apply to her, like the concepts, equally any sort of other thought from other areas of filmmaking do not apply to her. So I see what you mean. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, but one of the things I will say, just as a follow-up on that, after this film was made, it had been screened around in Delhi, a few places, and she got invited to, I think, JNU, where they screened her film, and they all, I don't know which department, but it was a seminar on gender inequality in Delhi, and so she actually had this whole engagement with like young students, academics, intellectuals, talking about the problem of with her at the center, right? She was the expert. She was the one, and apparently that was just such a proud moment for her. And she was sort of at an age where she's full of self-confidence, that she's fearless in the sense that, there can be a time when teenagers become very self-conscious, and in a sense, I don't know if it's not a requirement that teenagers go through that period of self-consciousness, but it was a very empowering thing. And for me, the thing that comes across, all these films, but perhaps this one more than others, is that actually being able to film, being a filmmaker, appears to be empowering to these children, and for me, as much as anything, that's what I get from that film. This is somebody who has been feeling this inequality and now has a kind of medium, a platform that actually gives it more legitimacy, that makes people listen to her. And
I think that's definitely one of the things that I felt in engaging with all three of the films, that the second one was very, very, very powerful, and also that children are not as young as we think for them to be. That they're really not. But thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think we've hit the 2-hour mark.
Yes, we've hit sort of the end of the event officially, but I want to say thank you very much to Stephen Hughes for talking us through the films and for letting us see them as well. And thank you all for coming along and for your great questions. I think it was a really good discussion that we had at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming along. I would have loved to have talked to every one of you and seen your faces, but anyway, I have all your names in front of me. Thank you.